what daily life under Khorne RELOY looks like in Warhammer 40K Hook. They say the blood god demands skulls. They never tell you what happens to those who gather them, or that some fates are worse than death on the killing fields. Introduction. The Crimson Doctrine. In the 41st millennium, there are countless ways to die. Starvation on hive worlds where corpse starch is a luxury. Execution for the crime of questioning. Vaporization when your transport hits a minefield. The Imperium of man grinds through billions of souls daily, each extinguished in service to a rotting god, corpse that never asked for their devotion. But there are worse fates than dying for the Emperor. There are the fates of those who live for the blood god. The Ordo Malleus maintains 17,000 documented worlds that have fallen to chaos undivided. Of those, approximately 3,000 show the distinct theological and material signatures of Khorne's dominion. These are not the temporary war zones where Khornate warbands rampage before moving on. These are planets where civilization, if such a word still applies, has reorganized itself entirely around the Skull Throne's demands, where every sunrise brings fresh horror, and the greatest fear is not death, but insignificant death. Death that doesn't matter. Death without glory or notice. The Inquisition seals these records behind crimson wax and genocidal protocols. They are not meant for human eyes. The information is too dangerous, not because it might corrupt, though it would, but because it reveals a terrible truth, that humans can adapt to anything. That given enough time, enough pressure, enough blood, entire populations will reshape themselves into something that serves the dark powers with the same mindless efficiency that hive workers serve the Imperium. This is not a tale of heroes. There are no heroes in Khorne's domain. Only killers, victims, and those who oscillate between the two roles until the distinction becomes meaningless. This is not a story of redemption, for redemption implies choice, and choice is the first thing sacrificed on the altar of the blood god. This is simply the truth, the unvarnished, visceral truth of what happens when an entire world arranges its existence around a single, screaming imperative: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. This is what daily life looks like when Khorne is not just worshipped but lived. Peronived, Mar Nin Gynen Skarvash, the waking bell. Kalin woke to the sound of the bronze bell, as he had every day for the past 11 years. 349 heartbeats. He had counted them once in his youth, before understanding that counting was a form of thinking and thinking was a distraction from purpose. The bell's tone was not melodious. It had been cast from the melted down weapons of the defeated Valen Defense Force, and the brass was impure, contaminated with iron and blood residue that had never properly burned away. The result was a sound like a scream caught in metal, a reverberating agony that ensured no one in the district slept through it. Sleep itself was not forbidden on Skarvash. Khorne did not demand that his subjects destroy themselves through exhaustion. That would be an offering to Nurgle, slow decay masquerading as devotion. The blood god wanted his followers strong, vital, capable of murder. But sleep was unproductive, and on Skarvash, everything existed on a spectrum between productive violence and wasteful weakness. Kaelin's eyes opened to the familiar sight of the barracks ceiling. Rust, red ferrocrete, the same color as everything else in Skarvash's undersprawl. Not painted that color. The Administratum had tried white once, in the early years after the fall. But the rust always came back, bleeding through even the thickest paint, staining everything the color of old blood. Eventually, they stopped trying. The rust was a reminder, the priest said, a sign that Khorne's favor touched all things. Around him, 217 other sleepers stirred. The barracks was called the Crimson Watch, 12th Dormitory, Section 40, 4 Sub-District Kalevar. Every adult in the undersprawl lived in such dormitories. The concept of private dwellings had been abolished in the 3rd year after the fall, when the blood priests had decreed that privacy bred weakness, contemplation, doubt. Families were a memory. Marriage was a relic. The only recognized unit of organization was the war band, and war bands lived communally. Kalen sat up on his sleeping mat. 2 centimeters of compressed synthetic fiber, adequate to keep the body off the cold floor, but uncomfortable enough to prevent lingering. Around him, others were doing the same. No one spoke. Morning was not a time for speech. Words required thought, and the first hour after waking was reserved for preparation. He looked down at his hands. They were a killer's hands now, though they hadn't started that way. 11 years ago, they had been a factory worker's hands, soft where they should be hard, hardened where they should be flexible. He had assembled lasgun power cells in manufacturum secundus, a mind-numbing job that nonetheless paid enough to afford a small apartment in the mid-hive and occasional luxuries. Recaf that actually tasted like something, protein that came from animals instead of vats. Those hands were gone. What remained were weapons. His knuckles were scarred white from 1,000 impacts. His right palm had a permanent callus from spear grip. His fingernails were perpetually stained. He had stopped trying to clean them after the first year, understanding that the stains were not a sign of poor hygiene but of purpose. Dried blood under the nails meant recent work. Clean nails meant days of shameful inactivity. He flexed his fingers, checking the range of motion. The left pinky was stiff. He had broken it 2 weeks ago during a dispute over ration distribution. The bone had set poorly, but he hadn't bothered with the medici. Poor healing was preferable to wasting time in the hospital or tents, time that could be spent in productive activity. Besides, pain was clarifying. Pain was honest. Pain reminded you that you were still alive, still useful. The ablution, the barracks had 8 communal wash stations. Not enough for 218 people, but that was intentional. The crush at the wash stations was the first test of each day. The strong got to wash first. The weak waited, and if they waited too long, they went without. Kalen was not strong, not compared to the warriors, the actual fighters who spent their days in the arena pits. But he was quick, and quickness counted. He moved through the press of bodies with practiced efficiency, his sharp elbows finding the soft spots in others' ribs, his feet placed to trip those who were too slow to adapt. By the time the 3rd bronze bell rang, the 2-minute warning, he had claimed a spot at the 5th wash station. The water was cold, always cold. The heating elements had been repurposed years ago, melted down to make weapons for the Crimson Host. Skarvash's contribution to the Blood God's eternal war. Cold water was another test, another opportunity to prove that comfort meant nothing, that only strength and will mattered. He scrubbed quickly, efficiently, not for cleanliness. True cleanliness was impossible in Skarvash, where the air itself tasted of copper and ash. But the act of washing was ritual required. The blood priest had decreed it after the 3rd plague, when Nurgle's servants had tried to infiltrate the hive through contaminated water. The plague had killed 40,000 before being contained, and the priests had decided that basic hygiene was acceptable as a practical measure, not a sign of weakness. The blood god cares not for filth or purity, only for worthiness in combat. But you cannot fight if disease has rotted your sword arm. Therefore wash, not for vanity, but for readiness. Kalen repeated the catechism in his mind as he scrubbed. It helped. The words were simple, direct, uncomplicated by philosophy or doubt. The blood priests were masters of such teachings. Every rule distilled to its most violent essence, every decree justified by its utility in service to Khorne. He was drying himself when the fight broke out. First blood, it started at the 3rd wash station, where a younger man, Kalen didn't know his name, only recognized him as part of the Rust Hound band, had apparently taken too long. The man behind him, broad, shouldered and scarred, had shoved him aside. The younger man had shoved back. Mistake. The scarred man's fist caught the youth in the throat. Not a wild swing, a precise, economical strike that crushed the windpipe and sent the younger man to his knees, gasping, clawing at his neck. The scarred man didn't pursue. He simply took the youth's place at the wash station and began scrubbing his arms, indifferent. Around the barracks, no one moved to help. Helping was weakness. If the youth couldn't defend his position, he didn't deserve it. That was the law, unwritten but absolute. Kalen watched as the young man's face turned purple, his gasps becoming wet, desperate sounds. The youth's hands scrabbled at the floor, seeking purchase, finding nothing. His eyes bulged. Blood vessels burst in his sclera, turning his eyes red. After perhaps 30 seconds, the convulsions stopped. The body went limp. The scarred man finished washing, dried himself, and walked past the corpse without a glance. Others stepped over it on their way to the wash stations. By the time Kalen left the ablution area, someone had already begun dragging the body toward the collection point, a chute in the north wall that led to the corpse. Furnaces. The body would be burned by midday. The skull would be cleaned, cataloged, and added to the district's quota. Every district in Skarvash had a quota. 8 skulls per 1,000 people per month. The number was not arbitrary. It had been calculated by the blood priests to maintain optimal population density while still providing sufficient offerings to the skull throne. Too few skulls meant the district was weak, complacent. Too many meant instability, chaos that served no purpose. Districts that fell short of their quota faced correction. Kalen had seen it once, 4 years ago, when the neighboring sub, District Malthane, had fallen short 3 months in a row. The Scarlet Enforcers had arrived at dawn and killed every 10th person, selected at random. The screaming had lasted for hours. The next month, Malthane exceeded its quota by 15%. Kalen dressed quickly, the same clothes he wore every day. Dark red tunic reinforced at the elbows and shoulders. Black trousers, practical and unrestricting. Boots that had once belonged to someone else. He had claimed them from a corpse 3 years ago, and they fit well enough. Everything was worn, stained, patched. New clothing was rare, a reward for exceptional service. Most people wore the cast-offs of the dead until the fabric literally disintegrated. The morning assembly. The 4th bell summoned them to assembly. 218 people filed out of the barracks into the street beyond. Though street was a generous term. It was a wide corridor, 30 meters across and stretching for half a kilometer before intersecting with the main arterial route through sub-district Kalivar. The walls were pocked with shrapnel scars from some ancient battle. The floor was stained with substances Kalen preferred not to identify. The assembly ground was a large plaza, pentagonal, open to the smog-choked sky 500 meters above. Once, this had been a market square where merchants sold textiles and spices imported from off-world. Now it was empty except for the altar of opening. The altar was a massive stone structure, 3 meters high and carved with scenes of battle. It was said to have been built from the rubble of the Administratum Palace, which had been torn down in the first year after the fall. The carvings depicted Skarvash's transformation, the initial riots, the storming of the Hive's spire, the execution of the planetary governor, the moment when the first blood priest raised the banner of Khorne over the smoking ruins. The artistry was crude but effective. The figures were anatomically incorrect, exaggerated in their violence, but that only made the scenes more visceral. At the altar's base stood priest Commander Volkith. Kalen had never heard Volkith speak quietly. The man's voice was a weapon, honed through decades of sermons and war cries. He stood atop the altar in his crimson robes, his augmetic jaw clicking as he drew breath, and when he spoke, every person in the plaza heard him clearly. CKLDMIOF, the response was immediate, reflexive. 218 voices, plus the thousands from the other barracks in the district, roared back. BL-Budfar, THE-BLO, Gogio, the dawn breaks, red over Skarvash! The enemy cowers across the stars! The weak pray to their corpse, God for salvation! Har-Ice O-N-O-Star D-Toch! Terra-Ice O-N-L Combat! THE-Ras O-N-L-Y. Techiskilla Ah! The call and response continued for several minutes. Kalen's voice joined the chorus automatically. The words required no thought. They had been seared into his mind through 11 years of repetition. morning, noon, and night. At every meal, at every assembly, the catechisms of Khorne distilled to their simplest form. Strength conquers all. Weakness deserves death. Honor the blood god through worthiness in combat. The coward and the weakling have no place in his domain. Volkith's sermon touched on the day's expectations, the ration distribution schedule, the week's combat lottery, 40 names drawn to fight in the arena pits, with half expected to die. The announcement of a new edict from the Crimson Host. All citizens between the ages of 12 and 50 were now required to participate in quarterly melee trials. Those who refused would be executed. Those who failed would be marked as unworthy and assigned to the corpse furnaces. Kalen listened with half his attention. The other half was focused on survival calculations. He was 34, old by Skarvash standards, where the average life expectancy was 37. He had avoided the combat lottery through a combination of luck and strategic positioning. He kept his head down, performed his duties efficiently, and never drew attention. But the new edict changed things. Quarterly trials meant exposure, meant risk. He would need to prepare. The morning ration after assembly, the crowd dispersed toward the ration stations. Food on Skarvash was distributed twice daily, morning and evening. The portions were calculated for maximum efficiency, enough to keep a worker functional, not enough to be comfortable. Hunger was another test, another opportunity to prove strength of will. The ration line stretched for 100 meters. Kylan took his place near the back, a tactical decision. The front of the line moved quickly but was more violent. People fought over the best portions, and fights at the front drew the attention of the enforcers. The back of the line moved slowly but was safer. He could wait. Around him, the murmur of conversation was minimal. People spoke in low voices, if at all. Loud conversation drew attention. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny could mean death. "You hear about Valkos's band." The voice came from behind him. A woman short and muscular, her face a roadmap of scars. Kalen didn't turn. Wiped out. All of them. Challenged the Rust Hounds to a territorial dispute. Rust Hounds killed 15 before Valkos's people broke and ran. Enforcers caught the survivors. Made an example. Kalen said nothing. Valkos had been ambitious, stupid. Territorial disputes were legal under Skarvash's codes, but only if you won. Losing a dispute meant weakness, and weakness meant correction. They say the enforcers took their skulls to the great altar. The woman continued. All 19 of them. Least they died with some honor. Honor. The word had a different meaning on Skarvash than it had in the Imperium. Imperial honor meant duty, sacrifice for the greater good, loyalty unto death. Khornate honor meant strength, victory, worthiness in the blood god's eyes. You could be a coward and still be honorable, as long as you were a strong coward. You could be virtuous and still be dishonorable, if your virtue came from weakness. Kalen had no illusions about honor. He had abandoned such concepts years ago, in the same purge of self that had taken his name. His real name, the one his parents had given him before the fall. That name was gone. Kalen was a used name, a designation. It meant survivor in the old hive cant. He had chosen it himself 3 years into his new existence, when he had finally accepted that the man he had been was dead. The line moved forward. Eventually, he reached the distribution window. The ration worker was a hollow-eyed woman who looked 60, but was probably 35. She glanced at his wrist, checking the tattoo that marked his district and work assignment, then slid a tray across the counter. The morning ration, a cup of protein paste, nutritionally complete but textureless. A slice of corpse, starch bread, gritty and dark. A small container of recaf substitute, brewed from stimulant-treated algae. The bread tasted like cardboard. The paste tasted like nothing. The recaf substitute tasted like bitterness and regret. Kalen ate mechanically, forcing down every bite. Refusing food was weakness. Wasting food was an insult to Khorne. The blood god provided sustenance so that his followers could fight. To waste that sustenance was to spit on his gifts. He ate standing, as did everyone else. There were no tables, no benches. Sitting during meals had been banned in the second year after the fall. Sitting implied leisure, comfort, weakness. You ate on your feet, ready to move, ready to fight. The work assignment after the meal, the work bells rang. Everyone in District Calavar had an assignment. Kalen's was in the Skull, processing facility 3 levels down. The descent was via a series of industrial elevators. Massive, rust-eaten platforms that groaned under the weight of dozens of bodies. The elevator shafts had once been transport tubes for goods moving between hive levels. Now they served a different purpose. The Skull processing facility occupied what had once been a warehouse district. Kalen had worked here for 7 years, and he knew every meter of the space. The facility was divided into 3 sections: intake, processing, and cataloging. Intake was where the skulls arrived. Thousands every day, harvested from the dead of Skarvash and the greater hive city beyond. They came in carts, piled high, still dripping. Some were fresh, still warm. Others were older, scavenged from the Undercity, where the poorest populations lived and died in anonymity. The intake workers sorted them by size and condition, separating the offerings worthy of the skull throne from the trash. Processing was where Kalen worked. This was where the skulls were cleaned, boiled in massive vats to strip away the remaining flesh and brain matter. The smell was indescribable, a thick, cloying stench of rendering meat and bone that saturated everything. Workers wrapped cloth around their faces, but it did little to help. After a few months, you stopped noticing the smell. After a few years, you stopped being able to smell anything else. Kalen's station was at Vat 13. He stood on a metal grating above a churning pool of boiling water and industrial solvents, using a long hook to pull skulls from the surface and place them on a conveyor belt. The belt carried them to the next station, where another worker would scrape away any remaining tissue before passing them along to cataloging. The work was dangerous. The vats were hot enough to melt flesh in seconds. Falls were not uncommon. Twice in the past year, workers had stumbled and gone into the vats. Both times, the only thing recovered was a skull, cleaned perfectly, ready for processing. The irony was not lost on anyone. Kylan worked with mechanical precision. Hook a skull, lift, place on the belt, repeat. His mind went blank during these hours, entering a state that was not quite meditation but something similar, a narrowing of consciousness to pure function. Thought was unnecessary. Emotion was unnecessary. There was only the work. Around him, dozens of other workers performed similar tasks. No one spoke except to warn of hazards. Speech was inefficient. Hours passed. Kalen's arms burned with fatigue, but he did not slow. Slowing meant weakness. Weakness meant correction. The midday horror at midday, the bells rang again, signaling the break. 15 minutes to rest, drink water, relieve oneself. 15 minutes, and not a second more. Kalen was drinking from a communal water station when the screaming started. It came from the cataloging section. High-pitched and desperate, everyone froze. Screaming was common in Skarvash, background noise easily ignored. But this was different. This was terror. Then came the roar. Kalen's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound. Everyone knew that sound. Damon. The creature erupted through the wall of the cataloging section in a spray of rubble and twisted metal. It was a bloodletter, one of Khorne's lesser daemons. But lesser was a relative term. The thing stood 3 meters tall, its skin the color of rage itself, muscles like iron cords beneath a hide that wept blood. Its head was bestial horned, the mouth full of brass fangs. In its hand, it wielded a hellblade, a weapon forged in the Imperium itself, wreathed in unnatural fire. The daemon's arrival was not unprecedented. Daemonic manifestations occurred on Skarvash with disturbing regularity. The veil between reality and the warp was thin here, worn down by decades of bloodshed and worship. The blood priests claimed these manifestations were blessings, proof of Khorne's favor. The daemons would appear, kill a few dozen people, and then vanish, satiated. The workers scattered. Some ran, others simply dropped to the ground, making themselves small, praying to be overlooked. Kalen did neither. He pressed himself against the wall and went absolutely still. Movement drew attention. The daemon's vision was attuned to motion, to the thrashing of prey. The bloodletter swept its gaze across the facility. Its eyes, burning pits of malevolence, fixed on a runner. The man was fast, but not fast enough. The daemon crossed 30 meters in 3 strides and brought its hellblade down in a scything arc. The worker was bisected at the waist, both halves hitting the ground in a spray of viscera. The daemon roared again, a sound that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the soul. It was a challenge, a demand. Fight me. Give me worthy blood. No one did. The workers of the skull processing facility were not warriors. They were laborers, grinders, the bottom of Skarvash's brutal hierarchy. Fighting a bloodletter was suicide. But failure to fight was also death. The daemon stalked forward toward a cluster of workers huddled against the far wall. It raised its blade. And then the enforcers arrived. There were 3 of them, clad in armor the color of dried blood, wielding chain, axes, and bolt pistols. They moved with the confidence of men who had fought daemons before and survived. The lead enforcer fired a burst from his pistol. The bolt struck the bloodletter in the chest, exploding in gouts of ichor and daemonic essence. The daemon's attention shifted. It lunged at the enforcers with inhuman speed. What followed was carnage. The enforcers were skilled, but the bloodletter was daemonic. It moved with a grace that defied its size, the hellblade weaving patterns of burning death. The first enforcer lost his arm at the shoulder. The second took a blow that sheared through his helmet and split his skull. Only the third managed to land a significant hit, his chain axe bit deep into the daemon's side, tearing a ragged wound that bled fire instead of blood. The bloodletter staggered. Its form began to lose cohesion, the wound disrupting the essence that bound it to reality. With a final, frustrated roar, it lashed out one more time. The hellblade caught the third enforcer across the chest, cutting through armor like parchment. The enforcer fell. The daemon flickered. For a moment, Kalen saw through it, saw the roiling chaos of the warp beyond. Then it was gone, banished back to the Imperium. Silence fell. Slowly, the workers emerged from their hiding places. Kalen counted the dead 7 workers, 3 enforcers. 10 skulls for the throne. Already other workers were moving to clean up. Bodies were dragged toward the disposal chutes. Blood was mopped up, not out of cleanliness, but because blood made the floors slippery, and slipping was inefficient. The dead enforcers' weapons and armor were stripped from their corpses. Such equipment was too valuable to waste. Within 15 minutes, the facility was operational again. Kylan returned to his station. He hooked another skull from the vat, placed it on the belt. Repeated. The horror of the past half-hour faded into the background static of existence. This was Skarvash. This was normal, par TWO after R1 Skarvash. The hierarchy of blood Skarvash's social structure was not complex, but it was absolute. At the top sat the Crimson Host, the planet's ruling military force, composed of Chaos Space Marines and their mortal auxiliaries. These were warriors who had fought across the galaxy, who bore the favor of Khorne himself. They were gods in red armor, and their word was law. Below them were the blood priests, the theological authorities who interpreted Khorne's will and enforced his doctrines. The priests were not warriors. Precisely. Most were former warriors too injured to fight, or scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding the blood god's nature. But they wielded immense power. A priest's decree could condemn entire districts. Their blessings could elevate a fighter from obscurity to glory. Below the priests were the enforcers, the police force, the maintainers of order. They were elite fighters, veterans of the arena pits, armed and armored at the host's expense. Enforcers had authority to kill at will, to correct any deviance from the codes, to extract the quota of skulls when necessary. Below the enforcers were the warriors, those who had proven themselves in combat, who had earned the right to fight in the arena pits, to join the war bands, to seek glory. Warriors enjoyed privileges, better rations, private quarters, the respect of their peers. But being a warrior also meant constant exposure to death. Most warriors died within 5 years of earning their status. Below the warriors were the workers, people like Kalen who served in essential but non-combatant roles. Workers kept Skarvash functional. They processed skulls, maintained infrastructure, produced weapons and armor, grew food in the undercity hydroponic farms. Workers had no privileges and few rights. They existed to support the warriors and, by extension, the blood god's eternal war. At the bottom were the unworthy, those who had failed, who had shown weakness, who served no useful purpose. The unworthy worked in the corpse, furnaces, and the waste, processing plants. They lived in cages. They ate once a day. Most died within months, and their deaths were not honored. Their skulls were marked with black ink, spoiled offerings unsuitable for the throne. Kalen was a worker, and he was content with that status. Not happy. Happiness was not a word that had meaning on Skarvash, but content. He had found equilibrium in his role. He knew the rules, understood the boundaries, and stayed within them. He was not ambitious. Ambition meant risk. Risk meant death. But the new edict, the quarterly melee trials, threatened that equilibrium. The evening ration was distributed at the same stations as the morning meal. The food was identical: protein paste, corpse, starch bread, stimulant beverage, nutritionally adequate, deeply unsatisfying. Kylan ate quickly, efficiently, and then returned to his barracks. The evening hours were personal time, a concept that still existed barely in the cracks of Skarvash's regimented existence. People used these hours to maintain equipment, to train, to engage in the brutal courtship rituals that passed for intimacy in a society built on violence. Kalen used the time to prepare. He retrieved his weapon from his footlocker, a simple spear, 2 meters long, the shaft made from reclaimed rebar, the point fashioned from a sharpened piece of industrial machinery. It was not elegant, but it was effective. He had killed 3 people with this spear over the years, all in self-defense, all legally. The weapon was registered, marked with his identification code. Owning an unregistered weapon was punishable by death. He spent an hour in practice, drilling the basic techniques. Thrust, parry, pivot, repeat. His movements were not graceful. He was no warrior, no trained fighter. But he was competent. He could defend himself, and in Skarvash, competence was the difference between life and death. Around him, others engaged in similar activities. A woman sharpened a knife. A man practiced unarmed strikes against a padded post. 2 younger workers sparred with wooden clubs, their movements clumsy but enthusiastic. No one spoke. Training was not a social activity. It was survival preparation undertaken with grim focus. The arena broadcast at sunset. The communal vox speakers crackled to life. This was the arena broadcast, the evening's entertainment, and one of the few diversions available in Skarvash. The arena pits were located in the mid-hive in what had once been a commercial district. The original structures had been gutted and rebuilt into a massive colosseum capable of holding 50,000 spectators. Attendance was not mandatory, but it was encouraged. The blood priests taught that watching combat honed the spirit, prepared the mind for violence, honored the blood god through vicarious participation. Kalen had attended the arena once in his early years on Skarvash. He had found it overwhelming, the noise, the crowd, the casual brutality. Now he preferred to listen to the broadcasts from the barracks. It was safer, quieter, less likely to result in accidental involvement. The broadcaster's voice boomed through the speakers. "Citizens of Skarvash! The evening trials begin. Tonight's first bout, Krovar the Unchained versus Silex the Flayer. 2 warriors, 1 victor. Blood for the blood god." The crowd roared, 50,000 voices united in bloodlust. Kalen could picture the scene. The 2 fighters circling each other in the sand, covered arena floor, the spectators screaming encouragement. The blood priests watching from their elevated platform, judging the worthiness of the combatants. The bout lasted 7 minutes. Kalen listened to the broadcaster's play-by-play, the descriptions of strikes and counters, The moment when Krovar feinted left and drove his axe into Silex's abdomen, the wet sounds of organs spilling onto the sand. The final roar as Krovar raised Silex's severed head to the crowd. Krovar the Unchained is victorious! His 11th triumph! Blood for the blood god! Skulls for the skull throne! The crowd roared again. Kalen imagined Krovar standing in the center of the arena, drenched in blood, basking in adulation. That was glory. That was what warriors lived for. The moment of triumph, the recognition of strength, the proof of worthiness. Kylan felt nothing. He had long ago severed the part of himself that could feel exhilaration or envy. He was hollow, a shell that performed its function and nothing more. The broadcast continued through the evening. Bout after bout, each one ending in death or crippling injury. The arena demanded blood, and the warriors provided it eagerly. The night sermon, at the 9th hour, the final sermon began. Priest, Commander Volkith's voice crackled through the Vox speakers, delivering the day's theological instruction. Children of Khorne, the day ends as it began. In blood and purpose, we have honored the blood god through our labors. We have fed the skull throne with worthy offerings. But remember, Khorne's gaze is eternal. He watches always, judging, measuring. The weak think they can hide, that they can coast through life unnoticed. But there is no hiding from the blood god. He sees all. He knows which of you strive and which of you merely exist. Kylan listened with half his attention. The sermons followed predictable patterns. Exhortations to strength, warnings against complacency, reminders of the consequences of failure. Tomorrow brings new challenges. The melee trials approach. All will be tested, and through testing we will separate the worthy from the chaff. Do not fear the trials. Embrace them, for it is only through struggle that we prove ourselves. Only through combat that we earn the blood god's favor. The sermon continued for 30 minutes, a relentless barrage of violent theology. Kalen had heard variations of this same speech hundreds of times. The words no longer carried meaning. They were simply noise, the background radiation of existence in Skarvash. When the sermon ended, the barracks fell silent. People began preparing for sleep, a necessary evil, a temporary weakness indulged because even Khorne's servants required rest. Kalen lay on his sleeping mat, staring at the rust-stained ceiling. His body ached from the day's labor. His hands throbbed. His mind was blank, scoured clean by routine. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. An endless procession of days, each one indistinguishable from the last, until the day he died, in the melee trials, in a work accident, in a random act of violence, or simply from exhaustion when his body finally gave out. This was his life now. This was all there was. He closed his eyes and drifted into dreamless sleep. Par thre tichi malai else, the selection, the trials were announced 7 days after the new edict. Kalen's name appeared on the roster posted in the district plaza, burned onto a sheet of metal alongside 347 others. The list was organized by age bracket. Kalen was in the 30 to 40 cohort, the oldest group that would compete. Beyond 40, the blood priests had apparently decided testing was pointless. Workers over 40 who couldn't fight were already living on borrowed time. He studied his name without emotion. Kalen Sub, District Kalivar, Barracks Crimson Watch, 12th, Work Assignment Skull Processing. The bureaucracy of death, meticulously maintained. Around him, others crowded the plaza, searching for their own names. Some reacted with visible fear, trembling hands, quick breaths, eyes darting like trapped animals. Others showed excitement, the manic energy of those who saw the trials as an opportunity to rise from worker to warrior. Most, like Kalen, simply accepted the information and began calculating survival strategies. The trials would take place in 3 days. Location Arena Pit Secundus, one of the smaller facilities scattered throughout the hive. Format mass melee, sorted by age bracket. Rules minimal. Weapons provided on site. Objectives survive for 30 minutes. Those still standing at the end would be marked as worthy and allowed to return to their normal duties. Those who fell but fought with honor would have their deaths recorded favorably. Those who cowered or fled would be executed immediately, their skulls marked as unworthy. The mathematics were brutal. Each age bracket had roughly 350 participants. Arena Pit Secundus could hold perhaps 200 comfortably. Overcrowding was intentional. It forced confrontation, eliminated any possibility of avoiding combat. In 30 minutes of mass melee with 350 desperate people, the survival rate would be perhaps 30%, maybe less. Kalen spent the evening doing calculations. 100 deaths minimum, likely more. The district's monthly quota was 8 skulls per 1,000 people. Sub-District Kalavar had approximately 18,000 residents. The quota was therefore 144 skulls. The trials would provide at least 100 from his age bracket alone, and there were 4 age brackets total. 400 skulls from a single event. Efficient. The blood priests were nothing if not efficient. Preparation the next 3 days passed in a strange fugue state. Work continued. The skull processing facility demanded constant attention, and skipping shifts to prepare for the trials was not permitted. But the atmosphere in the barracks changed. People began training more seriously, practicing with makeshift weapons, forming temporary alliances. Kalen avoided the alliances. Alliances required trust, and trust was liability. Besides, any alliance formed now would disintegrate the moment the trials began. Survival instinct would override social bonds within seconds. Instead, he focused on physical conditioning. He ran the length of the barracks in the morning before assembly, building endurance. He practiced the spear until his shoulders burned. He reviewed basic combat principles in his mind: maintain distance, conserve energy, strike only when the opportunity is clear, avoid becoming surrounded. On the second night, a woman approached him at the wash stations. She was perhaps 28, lean and hard-edged, with a scar across her left cheek that spoke of previous violence survived. "You're in the 30 cohort," she said. "Not a question." "Yes. You've killed before. I've watched you move. You have the look." Kalen said nothing. Admitting to previous kills was not dangerous. It was almost expected. But volunteering information was foolish. The woman continued, "I'm in the 20 cohort. We go first. If I survive, I'll watch your trial. After, I'll find you. I have a proposal." "Not interested." "You don't know what I'm proposing." "Don't need to. Proposals mean complications. Complications mean death." The woman smiled, a thin expression without humor. "Fair enough. But the offer stands. If you survive, look for Mira. Crimson Watch 18th. She walked away before Kalen could respond. He watched her go, filing the interaction away as a curiosity. Proposals, alliances, schemes. These were the province of those who still harbored ambition. Kalen had no ambition. He wanted only to continue existing, day after day, until existence ended. The night before, the final night before the trials, sleep was difficult. Around the barracks, people tossed and turned, their breathing irregular with anxiety. Some prayed, not to the Emperor, whose name was forbidden, but to Khorne himself, begging for strength, for worthiness, for the glory of dying well if death was unavoidable. Kalen did not pray. He had stopped praying years ago, after watching a priest murder a man for praying too loudly, for showing what the priest called unseemly desperation. The blood god, the priest had explained, valued strength and confidence. Begging was weakness. If you needed to beg Khorne for help, you had already proven yourself unworthy. Instead, Kalen reviewed his plan. The trials would be chaos. Hundreds of people in a confined space, all armed, all desperate. The first moments would be the most dangerous. People would strike wildly, driven by panic and adrenaline. Those who survived the initial minutes would have the advantage. They would be calmer, more focused, fighting against opponents who were already wounded and exhausted. Therefore, survive the opening. Stay defensive. Let others kill each other. Avoid the center of the arena where the press of bodies would be thickest. Find a position against a wall. Control the angles of attack. Conserve energy. Strike only when necessary. It was not a plan for victory. It was a plan for survival, which was the only victory that mattered. He finally slept around the third hour of morning, his mind settling into the dark quiet of exhaustion. The march, the waking bell, came too soon. Kalen rose with the others, mechanically completing his morning routine. Washing, dressing, assembly. The morning sermon was brief. Priest, Commander Volkith spoke about the trials, about the honor of testing, about the necessity of separating the worthy from the weak. You go to the arena not as condemned, but as aspirants, Volkith roared. This is your opportunity! Prove your strength, earn your place! And if you fall, fall with honor. The blood god watches. Make yourselves worthy of his gaze. After assembly, those whose names appeared on the roster were separated from the general population. 348 people. One had died in a work accident the previous day, reducing the number, were formed into a loose column and marched toward the arena. The march took 2 hours, winding through the Undercity's labyrinthine passages. Kalen walked in silence, surrounded by people he had lived near for years, but never truly known. Names without faces, faces without histories. Everyone in Skarvash was anonymous, replaceable, significant only in their utility. The arena came into view gradually, first as a distant structure, then as a looming edifice of rust, red metal, and ferrocrete. Arena Pit Secundus was smaller than the main Colosseum, but still massive by any reasonable standard. It could hold perhaps 5,000 spectators, and today it was nearly full. Workers from surrounding districts had been given the afternoon off to attend. Watching the trials was considered educational. The column was herded through a large gate into the arena's underbelly. Here, in dim corridors lit by flickering lumens, they were processed. Names checked against rosters, identification tattoos verified, weapons distributed. The weapon distribution was random, another layer of cruel efficiency. Kalen stepped up to the distribution table and received his weapon from a bored-looking enforcer. A club, wooden, reinforced with metal bands, approximately 1 meter long. Basic, brutal. Effective at close range but useless for maintaining distance. Not ideal. Kalen had trained with a spear, which allowed for defensive fighting from a safe distance. A club required closing to within arm's reach, exposing yourself to counterattack. But there was no appeal process. The weapon you received was the weapon you used. He hefted the club, testing its weight. Heavier than it looked. The wood was dense, likely iron oak from the Undercity farms. A solid hit would crack bone. 2 hits would cave in a skull. Around him, others received their weapons. Some got spears, lucky. Some got knives, less lucky, unless you were skilled at close combat. Some got clubs like his. One unfortunate soul received what appeared to be a weighted chain, brutal but requiring significant skill to wield effectively. Into the arena, they were held in a staging area beneath the arena floor for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. The space was cramped, hot, thick with the smell of sweat and fear. People stood in tight clusters, some still trying to form last-minute alliances, others isolating themselves in preparation. Kalen found a corner and waited. His mind was clear now, empty of everything except immediate tactical considerations. Fear was a distraction. Regret was pointless. There was only the moment ahead, the 30 minutes he needed to survive. Finally, the gates groaned open. Sunlight, or what passed for sunlight in Skarvash's smog, choked atmosphere, poured down from above. The roar of the crowd washed over them like a physical force. Below Dafar THTO 5,000 voices screaming in unison. The participants filed out onto the arena floor. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 50 meters in diameter, with sand covering the ground and high walls preventing escape. There were no obstacles, no cover, just open space and 348 people about to kill each other. Kalen moved immediately to the right, seeking the wall. Others had the same idea. By the time everyone had entered, the arena's perimeter was lined with people, all facing inward, weapons ready. The center was a kill zone. Anyone standing there when the trial began would be surrounded instantly. Above, in the observation boxes, Kalen could see the blood priests. Commander Volkith was there, along with others whose names he didn't know. They sat in judgment, watching, evaluating. A horn blew. Single note, harsh and metallic. The trial had begun. The first 5 minutes for perhaps 3 heartbeats, no one moved. 340. 8 people, frozen in a grotesque tableau of anticipation. Then someone screamed and charged forward, and the dam broke. The center of the arena exploded into violence. People who had been standing too close to each other lashed out reflexively. A woman swung a mace and caught a man in the side of the head. He went down instantly, skull cracked, blood spreading across the sand. Someone else stabbed downward with a spear, catching another combatant in the shoulder, driving them to their knees. Within seconds, the center had become a writhing mass of bodies, weapons rising and falling, blood spraying in arcs that caught the light and turned everything crimson. Kalen pressed his back against the wall and waited. 2 men near him were circling each other, weapons raised. He gave them space, edging further along the perimeter. The key was not to be perceived as a threat. People attacked what threatened them or what looked weak. Kalen tried to project neither, just another participant, watching, waiting. A woman broke from the central melee and ran toward the wall, perhaps seeking the same safety he had found. But she had made a mistake. She was running away from the fight, and in the Khornate codes, flight was cowardice. An enforcer appeared at the arena's edge, bolt pistol raised. A single shot. The woman's head exploded. Her body collapsed mid-stride. No fleeing. No cowardice. The message was clear. You could fight defensively, but you couldn't run. You had to engage, had to participate in the violence, or you would be executed. Kalen tightened his grip on the club. He would need to fight soon. Waiting too long would mark him as hesitant, which was only marginally better than cowardly. A man staggered toward him, bleeding from a deep cut across his chest. The man's eyes were wild, his weapon, a short sword, held in a trembling hand. He saw Kalen and seemed to make a calculation easier target than the chaos behind him. He lunged. Kalen sidestepped, a simple movement honed by 3 days of practice. The man's momentum carried him forward. Kalen brought his club down in a short, brutal arc, catching the man across the back of the skull. The crack was audible even over the din of combat. The man collapsed, unconscious or dead. It didn't matter which. Kalen had engaged. He had struck. He was participating. He stepped over the body and kept moving along the perimeter. Minutes 6 through 15, the pattern repeated itself. People would break from the central melee, wounded or exhausted, seeking space to recover. Others would pursue them or intercept them. Kalen fought when forced to, always defensively, always with controlled strikes designed to incapacitate rather than prolong the engagement. He learned quickly that the club's weight was both advantage and liability. Each strike carried tremendous force. He broke bones, caved in ribs, split skin, but the weapon was slow to recover. After each swing, he was vulnerable for a crucial second. He adjusted his technique, using shorter swings, keeping the club in constant motion even when not actively striking. By the 10-minute mark, the arena floor was a nightmare landscape. Bodies lay everywhere, some still moving feebly, others utterly still. The sand had turned to mud, the blood so thick it no longer absorbed properly. The smell was overwhelming. Copper and iron and opened bowels, the distinctive reek of mass violence. The crowd roared continuously, a sound that blended into white noise. Occasionally, Kalen could make out individual voices, "Blo-ko, oh, go-go," or "Escafartishql trauno," but mostly it was just an ambient scream, the collective voice of 5,000 people watching murder as entertainment. He realized, distantly, that he had stopped thinking in words. His consciousness had narrowed to pure reaction, movement and counter, movement, threat assessment and response, survival reduced to its most primal form. This was what the trials were meant to create: fighters who thought like predators, who moved like weapons. At the 12-minute mark, he encountered his first real challenge, A woman, the same woman who had approached him at the wash stations, Mira, stepped into his path. She was bleeding from several cuts, her clothes torn, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She held a spear, which gave her significant advantage over his club. "Kalen," she said, somehow making herself heard over the chaos. "Alliance, right now. No, don't be stupid. Two of us have better odds then." A man charged them from the side, screaming, wielding a chain. Mira pivoted smoothly and drove her spear through his throat. The man collapsed, gurgling, drowning in his own blood. Mira looked back at Kalen. "Alliance, or we fight each other. Choose." Kalen made a rapid calculation. Mira was skilled, far more skilled than him. If they fought, she would likely win. But if they allied, she might turn on him later. The question was whether temporary cooperation increased or decreased his survival chances. "Until the end," he said. "Then we separate." Agreed. Minutes 15 through 20, they moved as a unit, watching each other's backs. Mira used her spear to control distance, keeping attackers at bay. Kalen used his club to finish those who got past her guard. It was an effective partnership, brutal in its efficiency. Together, they cut a path back toward the perimeter. Other participants had similar ideas. Small groups forming, temporarily banding together against the chaos. But these alliances were fragile. Kalen watched one group disintegrate when a member saw an opening and turned on his allies, killing two before being overwhelmed by a third. Trust was always temporary in Skarvash. By the 20-minute mark, the initial 348 had been reduced to perhaps 150. The fighting had slowed, not because people were showing mercy, but because everyone was exhausted. Muscles screamed, lungs burned. The adrenaline that had fueled the first minutes was depleting, leaving only grim determination. Kalen's club was slick with blood. His arms felt like lead. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, peripheral awareness fading. He was running on autopilot, his body moving through trained responses while his mind floated somewhere distant and dark. Mira was flagging too. Her spear work remained precise, but slower. One of her legs was injured, not badly, but enough to affect her mobility. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "How much longer?" she asked. Kalen had no idea. Time had become meaningless, each second stretching into eternity, 30 minutes feeling like hours. He opened his mouth to respond. And that's when he saw it. The champion, the figure that entered the arena, was not a participant. That much was immediately clear. He wore armor, real armor, not the makeshift padding some combatants had cobbled together. Crimson plate, adorned with brass trim, the chest piece decorated with Khornate runes that seemed to wreathe in the light. He carried a two-handed axe, the blade etched with screaming faces. A warrior. A real warrior, one of the arena champions. The crowd's roar increased in pitch, becoming something like ecstasy. This was unexpected, unplanned. A special entertainment, a twist in the trials. The warrior. Kalen didn't know his name, only recognized him as one of the mid-tier champions who fought in the weekly bouts. Surveyed the arena floor with visible disdain. Then he pointed his axe at a cluster of combatants and charged. What followed was not combat. It was a demonstration. The warrior moved with practiced grace, his axe rising and falling in economical arcs. Each strike killed or crippled. He cut through the remaining participants like they were paper, utterly overmatching them in skill, strength, and equipment. This was the trial's true test, Kalen realized with cold clarity. The first 25 minutes had been sorting, separating the strong from the weak, the survivors from the dead. But this, the final 5 minutes, was the real examination. Those who could survive against a true warrior, or at least die while trying, would be marked as worthy. Those who broke, who ran, would be killed by the enforcers and marked as unworthy. The warrior cut down 15 people in perhaps 90 seconds. Then he turned and spotted Kalen and Mira. His eyes, visible through the helmet's visor, gleamed with anticipation. Fresh targets, ones who looked like they might provide actual challenge, however briefly. He started toward them. The final stand run, Mira said. Different directions. He can't chase both. No running, Kalen replied. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. Enforcers will shoot. Then we fight. We'll die. We'll die anyway. At least this way, we die with honor. Honor. That word again. Kalen had rejected it years ago, dismissed it as a fantasy for those who couldn't accept reality. But now, standing in an arena slick with blood, facing a warrior who would kill him in seconds, he found himself reconsidering. Not because honor had objective value, but because in Skarvash, honor determined how your death was recorded. An honorable death meant your skull would be added to the skull throne without marking, your name recorded in the district's rolls. A dishonorable death meant erasure, your skull marked as unworthy, your existence forgotten. He had survived 11 years in Skarvash. If he was going to die now, he could at least ensure the death counted. Together, he said. Mira nodded. They moved to meet the warrior. Around them, the remaining participants seemed to sense what was happening. Some charged with them, joining what was essentially a desperate last stand. Others backed away, seeking the perimeter, hoping the warrior would be too occupied to notice them. The warrior's axe rose. Kalen barely registered what happened next. There was movement. Mira's spear thrusting forward, other participants attacking from multiple angles, his own club swinging toward the warrior's head. There was the clang of metal on metal as the axe deflected attacks effortlessly. There was pain, sudden, shocking, a line of fire across Kalen's ribs where the axe blade grazed him. Then he was on the ground, his club gone, blood pouring from the wound. Around him, bodies fell. Mira went down, the axe catching her across the chest, armor and flesh parting with equal ease. The warrior stood over her, raised his axe for the killing blow. The horn blew. 3 times, sharp and clear. 30 minutes. The trial was over. The warrior froze mid-strike. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered his axe. He looked around the arena floor at the carnage, at the 67 people still standing or at least still breathing. Then he raised his axe to the sky and roared. BLR, teach ELO, go-RD. The crowd roared back, 5,000 voices united in savage joy. Kalen lay on the sand, pressing his hand to his side, trying to stanch the bleeding. Around him, the dead and dying covered the arena floor. 281 people had died in 30 minutes. 281 skulls for the throne. He had survived barely, but survived nonetheless. Part FOUR. THEAFTRMATH, the medici, the survivors were carried or walked out of the arena on their own power. Kalen staggered, his hand still pressed to his side, the world swimming in and out of focus. Blood loss, shock, exhaustion, his body was failing, systems shutting down one by one. He was dumped in a medica tent along with dozens of others. The tent was a nightmare of screaming and blood, understaffed chirurgeons moving between patients with brutal efficiency. Those who could be saved were treated. Those who were too badly wounded were given the Emperor's mercy. A quick injection that stopped the heart. No resources wasted on the dying. A chirurgeon examined Kalen's wound with practiced eyes. Lucky, she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Another centimeter and you'd have lost your liver. Clean cut. I can close it. She worked quickly, without anesthetic. Pain was sharpening. The blood priest taught. Pain reminded you that you lived. Kalen gritted his teeth and endured as the chirurgeon cleaned the wound, applied some kind of sealing agent, and wrapped his torso in bandages. Rest for 2 days, she instructed. Light duty for a week. You'll have a scar, but the wound will heal clean if you don't reopen it. When can I return to work? 2 days. Did you not hear me? I heard. When can I return to work? The chirurgeon's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of understanding or perhaps respect. Missing work meant reduced rations. Reduced rations meant weakness. Weakness meant increased risk of being deemed unworthy. Tomorrow, she said, but only processing duties. No heavy lifting. Kalen nodded. Tomorrow was acceptable. He was released from the medica tent that evening and made his way back to the barracks. The journey took 3 times longer than usual. his body protesting every movement. Several times, he had to stop and rest, leaning against walls, fighting waves of nausea. But he made it. He collapsed onto his sleeping mat and immediately lost consciousness. Recovery. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of pain and routine. Kalen returned to the skull processing facility as soon as he could stand, working through the agony of his healing wound. The chirurgeon had been right. The cut was clean, and it healed without infection. But healing was not the same as being whole. He moved stiffly, his range of motion limited, his efficiency reduced. No one commented. In Skarvash, injuries were common. You worked through them or you died. There was no middle ground. Mira had survived as well. Kalen saw her at assembly one morning, her torso wrapped in bandages, her movements careful. She caught his eye across the plaza and nodded once. An acknowledgement. Their alliance had ended when the horn blew, as agreed. But there was a connection now, the bond of shared survival. She didn't approach him, and he didn't approach her. The alliance had served its purpose. Nothing more was needed. The district's roster was updated to reflect the trial deaths. 281 names were removed, marked with the skull symbol that indicated honorable death. Their skulls had been processed, catalogued, and transported to the Great Altar in the hive's upper levels, where they would be added to the Great Pyramid of Bones that served as Skarvash's primary temple to Khorne. The survivors received no reward. Survival was its own reward. They were marked as worthy in the district records, which meant they would not be selected for the trials again for at least 2 years. That was all. Life continued. The skull processing facility demanded constant attention. The morning assemblies continued. The evening sermons droned on. The arena broadcasts provided nightly entertainment. The machine of Skarvash ground forward, consuming lives and producing skulls with industrial efficiency. Kalen settled back into routine. The trial became memory, then faded into the background static of existence. He had survived, and survival was the only victory that mattered. But something had changed. Something subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable. He had started thinking again. The thought thinking was dangerous. Kalen had learned that lesson early in his time on Skarvash. Thinking led to questioning. Questioning led to doubt. Doubt was a crack in the armor, an opening that could widen into full corruption. Not corruption toward chaos, which was expected and encouraged, but corruption away from Khorne, toward one of the other ruinous powers. Or worse, toward the insane hope of escape, rebellion, change. Such thoughts were punished savagely when discovered. The blood priests maintained networks of informants, and they possessed devices that could detect certain patterns of thought. Anxiety, hope, dissent. Regular testing was mandatory. Citizens would be called to the district temples, where they would be examined by priests wielding psychic instruments. Those who failed the testing would be corrected, a euphemism that covered everything from execution to lobotomy to transformation into servitors. Kalen had always passed the testing by not thinking, by reducing his consciousness to pure function, empty of philosophy or rebellion. He was a machine that happened to be made of flesh, nothing more. But now, lying on his sleeping mat in the hours after the evening sermon, staring at the rust-stained ceiling, he found himself unable to maintain that blank state. The thought was simple, almost pathetically so. There must be more than this. Not a thought of rebellion, not a prayer to the Emperor, not even a questioning of Khorne's supremacy. Just a vague, formless longing for something. Purpose beyond survival. Meaning beyond the collection of skulls. He tried to suppress it, to force his mind back into comfortable blankness. But the thought persisted, a splinter working its way deeper into his consciousness. During the trials, he had seen people die with honor, rushing to meet their deaths, fighting against impossible odds, screaming Khorne's name as they fell. He had seen the warrior in the arena, moving with confidence and purpose, every action meaningful, every kill a prayer. And he had realized something terrible. He envied them. Not their skill or their strength. He envied their certainty, They knew what they were. They had found their place in Khorne's hierarchy, understood their role in the great eternal war. They were complete in a way Kalen could never be. He was a survivor, nothing more. He endured not because he had purpose, but because he was too stubborn or too cowardly to die. He existed in the cracks, too weak to be a warrior, too functional to be disposed of, trapped in an eternal middle state that served no one, least of all himself. The thought festered. He tried to ignore it, but it grew stronger, demanding attention. There must be more than this. The priest, 3 weeks after the trials, Kalen was summoned to the district temple for routine testing. He went without resistance, without hope. Testing was inevitable, and resistance meant immediate execution. The temple was a converted warehouse, its interior gutted and rebuilt into something that resembled holy architecture. The floor was covered in brass plates, each one etched with Khornate runes. The walls were decorated with weapons, thousands of them, offerings from citizens, each one representing a life taken in service to the blood god. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but Kalen knew what was up there: chains, from which hung the bodies of those who had failed previous tests. Left to desiccate as warnings, he was directed to a small chamber off the main hall. The chamber contained only a chair, metal, uncomfortable, fitted with restraints, and a console manned by a junior priest. The priest was young, perhaps 19, his face still smooth beneath the ritual scars that marked his station. He gestured for Kalen to sit. "Name and identification," the priest said, his voice bored. "Kalen, Sub-District Kalavar, Barracks Crimson Watch, 12th Work Assignment. Skull Processing." The priest entered the information into the console. Then he approached with a device, a circlet of metal and wire, connected to the console by a thick cable. "Standard testing," the priest explained, though no explanation was necessary. "Don't resist. Don't try to suppress your thoughts. The machine can detect suppression, and suppression is treated as suspicious activity." The circlet was placed on Kalen's head. It was cold, uncomfortable, the interior lined with small needles that pricked his scalp without quite breaking skin. The priest returned to the console and activated the device. Kalen felt something, not quite pain, not quite pressure. A sensation like fingers rifling through his mind, sorting through memories and thoughts with clinical detachment. The device was not psychic in the true sense. It couldn't read specific thoughts or access deep memories. But it could detect patterns: anxiety, hope, fear, doubt, the emotional signatures that indicated dangerous thinking. The priest watched the console readout, his expression neutral. Seconds passed. Kalen forced himself to remain calm, to think of nothing, to be nothing. The fingers in his mind found the thought. There must be more than this. Kalen's heart rate spiked. The priest's eyes flickered toward a particular readout on the console. "Interesting," the priest murmured. Silence. The device continued its work. Kalen sat frozen, waiting for the inevitable declaration: "Suspicious activity detected. Correction required." But it didn't come. Instead, the priest deactivated the device and removed the circlet from Kalen's head. "You're cleared," he said. "You may go." Kalen stood slowly, carefully, not quite believing. "Cleared?" "Yes. The reading shows baseline anxiety and some minor dissatisfaction. Both are normal and expected given recent events. The Millie trials are traumatic. Residual psychological effects are permitted, even encouraged. They indicate that you took the trial seriously, that you internalized its lessons." "I see." The priest made a notation on the console. "However, I'm marking your file for follow-up testing in 3 months instead of the standard 6. Your anxiety levels are slightly elevated, not enough to warrant correction, but enough to suggest monitoring." Dismissed. Kalen left the temple, his mind racing. The priest had seen the thought. He was certain of that. The device had detected it, flagged it, brought it to the priest's attention, and the priest had dismissed it as normal. Why? The answer came to him slowly, over the course of the walk back to his barracks. Because the thought was not rebellious, it was ambitious. The desire for more, in Skarvash didn't mean escape or heresy. It meant ascension. It meant the desire to rise from worker to warrior, to find meaning through greater violence, to become worthy of Khorne's notice. The priests wanted that kind of thinking. It drove citizens toward the arenas, toward the trials, toward volunteering for the war, bands that exported Skarvash's violence to other worlds. Ambition served the blood god. As long as it was directed correctly, the thought had saved him, not because it was harmless, but because it was useful. Part FIV, TCSCNT, the choice, the next month passed in growing clarity. Kalen's wound healed completely, leaving only a scar, a raised white line across his ribs that he touched sometimes in the morning, a reminder of the trial, of survival, of the moment when he had chosen honor over cowardice. But survival was no longer enough. The thought had awakened something in him, a hunger he couldn't suppress. He watched the arena broadcasts with new attention, studying the fighters, analyzing their techniques. He trained in the evenings with increased focus, pushing his body harder, accepting the pain as necessary. He understood now what had happened. The trial had broken something in him. The protective numbness he had built up over 11 years. He had been a shell, a hollow thing that performed its function and nothing more. But the trial had forced him to choose, to consciously decide between cowardice and honor, and that choice had reactivated some dormant part of his humanity. He was no longer content to merely exist. He wanted meaning, purpose, a role beyond skull, processing, and survival. He wanted to become a warrior. The path was clear. Skarvash's warrior bands recruited from the worker population constantly, seeking fresh bodies to replace those who died in the arenas and in off-world campaigns. The recruitment process was simple. Demonstrate competence in combat, pass a series of trials more intensive than the quarterly millies, and survive the initiation. The mortality rate was approximately 70%. Most applicants died during the trials or the initiation. Those who survived rarely lived more than 5 years afterward. Warrior life was brutal, violent, short. But those 5 years would have meaning, would be about something beyond the simple, grinding continuation of existence. Kalen made his decision 3 weeks after the testing. He submitted his application to the district recruitment office, a small facility near the arena pits. The clerk who processed his application was an older man, scarred and grizzled, missing his left eye. He looked at Kalen's age, 34, and raised an eyebrow. "You're old for this," the clerk said. "Yes, most applicants are under 25. Better reflexes, heal faster, don't have as many bad habits to unlearn." "Yes." "You understand the survival rate?" "Yes." The clerk studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your funeral. Report to Training Ground Septimus tomorrow at dawn. Bring your registered weapon. If you're late, we'll assume you changed your mind and mark you as a coward." "Clear, clear." The clerk made the notation. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. Kalen left the office with a strange lightness in his chest. Not quite hope. Hope was too dangerous. But something similar. Anticipation. Purpose. He was going to die, probably within the next few weeks. But at least he would die trying to be something more than a skull processor. Training Ground Septimus dawn came cold and red. The sun a dim smear behind layers of industrial smog. Kalen arrived at Training Ground Septimus with his spear. He had reclaimed it from his footlocker, the familiar weight reassuring in his hands. The training ground was a large courtyard, walled on all sides, the floor bare ferrocrete stained with old blood. Approximately 60 people were gathered there, the new recruits, drawn from across District Kalavar and the surrounding areas. They ranged in age from 15 to 40, though most clustered in the early 20s. Kalen was among the oldest. At the center of the courtyard stood their instructor. He was a warrior, obvious from the way he moved. The confidence in his bearing, the scars that decorated every visible inch of skin. He wore light armor, crimson and black, and carried a chain axe mag locked to his back. His face was brutal, all hard angles and cold eyes, the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile decades ago. I am Sergeant Kravos, he announced, his voice cutting through the morning air. For the next 4 weeks, I am your god. You will obey my every command instantly and without question. Those who hesitate will be beaten. Those who fail will be dismissed or killed, depending on how badly they fail. Those who survive will be considered for initiation into the war bands. He began pacing, his eyes scanning the assembled recruits. Look around you. 60 applicants. 4 weeks from now, maybe 20 of you will still be here, maybe less. The rest will be dead, broken, or revealed as unworthy. I don't care which category you fall into. My job is not to make you survive. My job is to find the ones who are already strong enough to deserve survival. Kravos stopped pacing and drew his chain axe. The weapon roared to life, teeth spinning, the sound like a scream given mechanical form. First lesson: pain is your friend. Pain tells you where your limits are. Pain teaches you how to push past those limits. Pain is Khorne's gift to his children, the sensation that separates the living from the dead. He gestured to a recruit in the front row, a young man, perhaps 18, athletic and confident looking. You. Step forward. The young man did, his chin raised, trying to project fearlessness. Hit me, Kravos ordered. The young man hesitated. What? Hit me, as hard as you can. Don't hold back. This is your opportunity to strike a warrior with no consequences. Take it. The young man glanced around, uncertain, then made his decision. He swung his fist in a wide haymaker aimed at Kravos's jaw. Kravos caught the fist mid-swing. His hand closed around the young man's knuckles and squeezed. The sound of breaking bone was audible across the courtyard. The young man screamed. Lesson learned, Kravos said, releasing him. The young man collapsed, cradling his shattered hand. Power without technique is useless. Confidence without skill is suicide. You are all weak. You are all ignorant. You are all going to suffer. And through suffering, some of you, a precious few, will become strong. He raised his voice, addressing the entire group. Training begins now. Form lines. We're going to see if any of you know how to hold a weapon correctly. The first week, the training was relentless. They drilled from dawn until the evening assembly, with only brief breaks for water and minimal food. Kravos pushed them through endless repetitions of basic techniques: stance, footwork, strike, parry, riposte. The movements were simple, but performing them correctly, while exhausted, while injured, while your body screamed for rest. That was the challenge. Kalen struggled. His age was a disadvantage. His body couldn't recover as quickly as the younger recruits. Injuries accumulated: pulled muscles, jammed fingers, countless bruises. But he endured. He had survived 11 years in Skarvash, survived the melee trials. He could survive this. The attrition began immediately. On the second day, 3 recruits quit. They simply walked away during the midday break, unable to continue. Kravos let them go without comment, but marked their names in his record book. They would be marked as cowards, suitable only for the lowest work assignments. On the third day, a recruit died. He had been sparring with practice weapons, wooden training implements designed to hurt but not kill. When he made a mistake, his opponent's strike caught him across the throat, crushing his windpipe. The recruit collapsed, gasping, suffocating. Kravos watched impassively as the young man died, then ordered 2 others to drag the body to the disposal chute. His mistake was overextending. Kravos explained to the remaining recruits. Hay committed to a thrust without maintaining defensive positioning. In a real fight, that mistake would have killed him just as surely. Better he learned the lesson here, where it only cost 1 life, than in the arena where it might have cost a dozen. The dead recruit's training weapon was cleaned and given to someone else. Training continued. By the end of the first week, 43 recruits remained. The second week, week 2, introduced live steel. They transitioned from practice weapons to real ones. Not their registered personal weapons, but training arms provided by the facility. These were functional killing implements, only slightly dulled to reduce accidental fatalities. The sparring became lethal. Kravos divided them into pairs and ordered them to fight at 75% intensity. Not full contact, he explained. Not yet, but enough to draw blood, enough to hurt. Learn to fight while bleeding. Learn to maintain focus while injured. Pain is clarity. Kalen was paired with a woman named Senna, younger than him by a decade, fast and aggressive. Their first bout lasted 3 minutes and ended with Kalen on the ground, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, Senna's blade at his throat. Dead, Kravos declared. Kalen, your defense is adequate, but your offense is non-existent. You fight like someone trying not to lose, not like someone trying to win. Understand the difference. Kalen understood. His entire strategy had been built around survival, not victory. That had been sufficient in the melee trials, where surviving was the only objective. But in single combat against a trained opponent, passive defense wasn't enough. He adjusted. The next bout, he took risks, committed to attacks even when it opened his defense, pressed forward when his instinct was to retreat. He lost again, but this time he managed to draw blood before Senna finished him. Better, Kravos said. Still dead, but better. Again. They fought a dozen times that day. Kalen lost every bout, but each loss taught him something, where his timing was off, where his technique failed, where his conditioning was inadequate. He began to internalize the lessons, his body learning through repetition and pain. By the end of the second week, 31 recruits remained. The training ground's disposal chute had processed 7 bodies. 3 more had quit. 2 had been dismissed for incompetence. The third week, week 3, was psychological. Kravos introduced them to the cage, a small metal box, 1 meter square, barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. Each recruit was required to spend 12 hours in the cage, alone, in complete darkness, listening to recordings of battle, sounds screaming, weapons clashing, explosions, death rattles. Khorne values fury, Kravos explained, but controlled fury. Rage without discipline is chaos. Chaos serves the changer of ways, not the blood god. You will learn to maintain your center, even when every instinct demands you lose control. Kalen's turn in the cage came on the 3rd day of the week. He was locked inside, the door sealed, and immediately the darkness became absolute. The recordings began, a cacophony of violence that surrounded him, pressed against him, invaded his consciousness. At first, he tried to block it out, to retreat into the mental blankness he had cultivated over the years. But that didn't work. The sounds penetrated, triggered responses he couldn't suppress. His heart rate increased. His breathing became shallow. Panic crept in at the edges of his awareness. Can't move, can't escape, trapped. The box wasn't just about enduring discomfort. It was about confronting the terror of helplessness, the knowledge that you were utterly at someone else's mercy. It simulated capture, imprisonment, the moment when a warrior's power was stripped away. Hours passed. Kalen's sense of time disintegrated. He might have been in the cage for 3 hours or 30. The sounds continued, relentless, a soundtrack of eternal war. He found himself starting to dissociate, his consciousness fracturing. And then he remembered the trial, the moment when the warrior had stood over him, axe raised, and he had thought, "At least I tried. At least I didn't run." That memory became an anchor. He focused on it, used it to rebuild his sense of self. He wasn't helpless. He had chosen this. He was enduring the cage not because he was forced to, but because he had decided to pursue something greater than survival. The distinction was crucial. Victimhood versus agency. Suffering inflicted versus suffering chosen. When the door finally opened and light flooded in, Kalen emerged changed. Not broken, as some recruits were. 3 had to be carried out, catatonic, and were dismissed as mentally unfit. Changed. He understood now what Kravos had been teaching. Khornate warriors needed to be able to endure anything. Pain, fear, helplessness, and still maintain the will to fight. The cage stripped away all pretense, all false confidence, and revealed what remained at your core. For some, nothing remained. They broke. For others, what remained was anger, inchute, undirected rage that would make them dangerous but ultimately useless, as likely to kill allies as enemies. For a few, what remained was cold purpose. The understanding that suffering was temporary, that will could override any physical or psychological torture, that the self was ultimately inviolable as long as you refused to surrender it. Kalen was one of the few. By the end of the third week, 23 recruits remained. The fourth week, the final week, was integration. Kravos divided the remaining recruits into squads of 5 and ran them through tactical exercises, mock battles against other squads, ambush scenarios, assault drills, fighting while carrying wounded, fighting while exhausted and starved. Kylan was assigned to Squad Crimson 7. His squad mates were Senna, the woman who had repeatedly defeated him in single combat, fast, aggressive, skilled with paired knives. Jorik, a massive man who wielded a two-handed maul and served as the squad's shock trooper. Ness, quiet and precise, an ex-manufacturum worker who had taught himself the lasgun and now carried a battered rifle scavenged from somewhere. Lyra, young and frighteningly competent, the daughter of an enforcer, raised in violence from birth. Together, they learned to fight as a unit. Kalen discovered he had a talent for tactical coordination. His years of skull processing had trained him to think in terms of flow and efficiency, to identify patterns and optimize processes. He applied the same skills to combat, identifying how each squad member's strengths could complement the others, where to position people, when to commit to an assault, and when to withdraw. He wasn't the best fighter in the squad. That was probably Lyra. He wasn't the strongest. Jorik. He wasn't the fastest. Senna. But he could think during combat, could maintain strategic awareness even in chaos, and that made him valuable. Kravos noticed. On the 5th day of the 4th week, he pulled Kalen aside. "You're adequate," Kravos said. It was the closest thing to praise Kalen had heard from him. "Not exceptional. Your technique is mediocre. Your conditioning is poor for your age. You'll probably die in your first real engagement." "Yes, Sergeant." "But you think. Most warriors don't. Most warriors are weapons, sharp, effective, but weapons nonetheless. They point where they're aimed and they cut. You might be capable of more." "You might be able to lead." Kalen said nothing. Leadership had never been his ambition. He had only wanted to stop being nothing. "I'm recommending you for initiation," Kravos continued. "Your entire squad, actually, Crimson 7, performed adequately throughout the exercise. You'll undergo initiation in 3 days. Prepare yourselves." The initiation ritual was held in the sub-levels beneath the arena complex, in chambers that predated Skarvash's fall to chaos. These had been maintenance tunnels once, part of the Hive's ancient infrastructure. Now they were sacred space, dedicated to Khorne, decorated with trophies and offerings. The 23 remaining recruits were led down by Kravos and 2 other warriors. They descended through darkness, through air that grew hot and thick, until they reached a large chamber lit by burning braziers. At the chamber's center stood an altar, rough, hewn stone, stained black with blood that had soaked into the rock over decades. Behind the altar stood a blood priest, not Volkith, but someone Kylan didn't recognize, older and more scarred, his eyes gleaming with zealot intensity. "You have endured the trials," the priest intoned. "You have proven yourselves worthy of consideration. But worthiness must be sealed. It must be marked in flesh and blood. It must be witnessed by the blood god himself." The priest gestured to the altar. "One by one you will approach. You will make your offering. You will speak your oath. And if Khorne accepts you, you will be marked as his warriors." The first recruit was called forward. A young man named Torvin, lean and hungry looking. He approached the altar and knelt. "What do you offer?" the priest asked. Torvin drew a knife and made a deep cut across his left palm. Blood welled, dripped onto the altar. "My blood, freely given." "What do you swear?" "To serve the blood god in all things. To seek worthy combat. To never show cowardice. To die with honor when my time comes." The priest placed his hand on Torvin's head. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Torvin convulsed, his back arching, a scream tearing from his throat. When it ended, he slumped forward, gasping. The priest removed his hand. On Torvin's forehead, visible through parted hair, was a mark, a rune burned into the flesh, scar white against his skin. The mark of Khorne, the sign that he had been accepted. Torvin staggered to his feet and was led aside by one of the warriors. The next recruit was called forward. The ritual continued. One by one, the recruits approached, made their offerings, spoke their oaths. Most were accepted. The mark appeared, they screamed. They were led aside. 3 were not accepted. When the priest touched their heads, nothing happened. No convulsion, no mark. Just silence. Khorne finds you unworthy. The priest declared to each one. You may have passed the mortal trials, but the blood god sees what lies in your hearts, and he rejects you. The 3 were led away by the warriors. Kalen never saw them again. He didn't know if they were killed, returned to worker status, or assigned to some other fate. It didn't matter. Finally, his name was called. Kalen stepped forward. He approached the altar on legs that felt distant and unreal. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. 4 weeks of training, 11 years of survival, a lifetime of choices and compromises, all leading to this single moment. He knelt. What do you offer? Kalen drew his knife and cut his palm, deep and clean. Blood poured onto the altar, steam rising where it struck the ancient stone. My blood freely given. What do you swear? The oath was simple, the same words 20 others had spoken. But as Kalen said them, he meant them in a way he had never meant anything before. To serve the blood god in all things. To seek worthy combat. To never show cowardice. To die with honor when my time comes. The priest's hand descended, palm pressing against Kalen's forehead. Heat, unimaginable heat, as if the priest's hand was made of molten brass. It burned through skin, through bone, directly into his brain. Kalen tried to scream, but his throat locked, vocal cords paralyzed. The heat increased, became pain, became everything. And then he was somewhere else. The vision, he stood on a plain of brass and bone, beneath a sky the color of rage. The plain stretched to infinity in all directions, carpeted with skulls. Billions upon billions of them, a monument to endless slaughter. In the distance, mountains rose. Not natural formations, but pyramids of bones, so tall they pierced the crimson clouds. At the center of the plain stood a throne. The skull throne. It was immense, a structure of bone and brass that dwarfed mountains, that made the pyramids look like children's toys in comparison. Thousands of steps led up to the throne's seat, each step made from fused skulls, each skull bearing the marks of violent death. The throne itself was wreathed in fire, not the natural fire of combustion, but something else, something that burned without consuming, that radiated malice and glory in equal measure. And on the throne sat a figure. Kalen couldn't look at it directly. His eyes slid away, unable to hold the image, but he caught fragments armor of brass and bronze, a body that was somehow both impossibly massive and perfectly proportioned. Eyes that were pits of infinite fury, a presence that was both god and warrior, divinity expressed as perfect violence. Khorne, the blood god, did not speak. Speech was too limited, too human. But Kalen knew, with absolute certainty, what was being communicated. You are seen, you are measured, you are found adequate. Not exceptional, not chosen, not special, just adequate, worthy of service, but nothing more. And that was enough. The vision shattered. Kalen found himself back in the chamber, collapsed on the floor, blood streaming from his nose and ears. The priest stood over him, expression neutral. You are marked, the priest said. Rise, warrior. Kalen staggered to his feet. He touched his forehead and felt scar tissue. The mark burned into his flesh. He had been accepted. He had become a warrior of Khorne. Parts seek. Warrawars left the war, banned following initiation. The new warriors were assigned to war bands. Kalen's squad, Crimson 7, was kept intact and folded into a larger formation called the Red Reapers, a war band of approximately 200 warriors who served as rapid assault troops for the Crimson host. The Red Reapers' barracks were nothing like the worker dormitories. Private rooms, small, sparse, but private, replaced communal sleeping areas. Better rations, real meat occasionally, vegetables grown in the hydroponic farms, recaf that actually tasted like recaf. Proper equipment, armor fitted to each warrior's frame, weapons maintained by dedicated tech priests, medical care that included anesthetics and regenerative treatments. These were not luxuries. They were investments. Warriors were valuable resources, trained and proven, worth maintaining. Workers were replaceable. Warriors were not. But the privileges came with expectation. Warriors fought. That was their purpose, their reason for existing. And the Red Reapers fought constantly. The arena circuit, the war band's primary duty, was providing combatants for Skarvash's extensive arena system. The main Colosseum hosted bouts every evening, but there were dozens of smaller arenas throughout the hive, each one operating multiple events daily. The appetite for blood sport was insatiable. Millions of workers needed distraction, needed entertainment, needed the vicarious thrill of watching others kill and die. The Red Reapers rotated through these venues on a weekly schedule. Each warrior was expected to fight at least once per week, more if they were particularly skilled or popular with the crowds. Kalen's first bout was scheduled for 3 days after his initiation. He was paired against another newly initiated warrior, a young man named Vex, eager and overconfident. The bout was held in Arena Pit Tertius, one of the mid-sized facilities, before a crowd of perhaps 2,000. Kalen had never fought before a crowd. The worker melee trials had spectators, but that had been chaos, hundreds of participants obscuring individual combatants. This was different. This was spotlight and scrutiny, every move visible, every mistake magnified. They entered from opposite sides of the arena. Kalen with his spear, Vex with a sword and shield. The referee, a scarred veteran, announced the rules. Fight until surrender, incapacitation, or death. Killing your opponent is permitted but not required. Blood for the blood god. Elodafog! The crowd roared back. The horn blew. Vex charged immediately, shield raised, sword held in a high guard, aggressive, confident, the tactics of youth. Kalen circled, keeping distance, using his spear's reach advantage to probe Vex's defense. The younger warrior was fast, his shield work adequate, but he was predictable. After 2 minutes of circling and light engagement, Kalen had identified the pattern. Vex's shield always drifted left after blocking. A tiny tell, barely noticeable, but consistent. Kalen finted right. Vex's shield moved to intercept. Kalen redirected, thrusting left. The spear point caught Vex just above the collarbone, punching through armor and into flesh. Not fatal, not disabling, but painful and bleeding. Vex staggered, the wound compromising his shield arm. Kalen pressed the advantage, striking twice more, once to the thigh, once to the abdomen. Shallow cuts, controlled strikes designed to accumulate damage without killing. After 4 minutes, Vex collapsed, blood loss and pain overcoming his will to continue. The referee called the match. Victor Kalen. The crowd's response was tepid. They had expected death, proper death, and instead received a technical victory. Some booed. Others merely looked disappointed. Kalen ignored them. He had fought efficiently, honorably, and survived. That was what mattered. He offered Vex his hand, helping the wounded warrior to his feet. Vex accepted, grimacing. "Well fought," Vex said through gritted teeth. "You too." They were led to the medica station beneath the arena. Vex would need stitches and blood replenishment, but would recover fully. Kalen was uninjured except for minor bruises. Afterward, their squad leader, a veteran named Kroos, found Kalen in the barracks. "Competent," Kroos said. His tone suggested this was high praise, but the crowd wasn't pleased. They want spectacle. They want rage and fury. "You fought like you were trying to pass a test." "Not honor, Khorne. I fought to win. Winning isn't enough. You're a warrior now. You represent the blood god in the arena. Every bout is a prayer. Every strike is an offering. The crowd needs to see that. They need to feel Khorne's glory through your actions." Kalen considered this. You want me to be more aggressive, less controlled. I want you to fight like you mean it. Like you're not just trying to survive, but trying to dominate. There's a difference. Learning glory over the next weeks, Kalen fought 7 more bouts. He won 6, lost 1. An embarrassing defeat against a more experienced warrior who read his defensive tactics instantly and pressed him until he made a fatal mistake. Only the referee's intervention prevented his death. But he learned. He learned that the arena was theater as much as combat. That the crowd's favor could mean better equipment, better assignments, recognition that translated to opportunity. He learned to project aggression even when fighting defensively, to roar challenges, to make each kill dramatic and visible. He learned to enjoy it. That was the most disturbing discovery. The pleasure that came from combat, from the moment when your weapon struck home and an opponent fell. It wasn't sexual, wasn't like any pleasure he had known before. It was colder, purer. The satisfaction of excellence, of performing your function perfectly, of being exactly what you were meant to be. The blood god's touch, subtle and insidious, reshaping his psychology one fight at a time. By his 15th bout, Kalen had developed a minor following, not fame. True fame was reserved for the grand champions, the warriors who fought in the main Colosseum before crowds of 50,000. But enough recognition that people knew his name, that gamblers included him in their wagers, that the arena operators started matching him against more challenging opponents. His 17th bout was scheduled against a champion, a warrior named Hager the Crimson, who had 53 victories and was considered one of the Red Reaper's elite fighters. Against the champion, the bout was held in the main Colosseum. Kalen's first time fighting before a crowd of that size. The noise was overwhelming. 50,000 voices united in bloodlust, screaming for violence, for death, for glory. Hager entered first, his armor painted crimson, his twin axes gleaming. He was massive, perhaps 2 meters tall, muscles like corded iron. The crowd roared his name, ha-ha-ga, ha-gar. Then Kalen's name was announced. The response was smaller, polite interest rather than worship. He was still a newcomer, unproven in the major venues. They faced each other across the sand. Hager grinned, a predator's expression. "Heard you're competent," Hager said, his voice carrying over the crowd noise. "Let's see if that's true." The horn blew. Hager charged, both axes swinging in synchronized arcs. Kalen backpedaled, using his spear to maintain distance, each thrust designed to disrupt Hager's advance. But the champion was experienced. He slipped each thrust, his axes batting the spear aside, closing distance relentlessly. Within 30 seconds, Kalen was against the arena wall, his spear's advantage negated. Hager's axes descended in a killing pattern. Kalen dropped his spear and rolled, the axes striking the wall where he had been. He came up with his secondary weapon, a short sword, and slashed at Hager's exposed side. The blade scraped across armor, failing to penetrate. Hager pivoted, one axe lashing out. Kalen blocked with his sword, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. They separated, circling. Kalen retrieved his spear. Hager adjusted his grip on his axis. The crowd was screaming, the noise like physical pressure. They engaged again. This time, Kalen fought differently. Not defensively, not trying to survive, but trying to win. He took risks, committed to attacks even when it opened his defense, pressed forward when his instinct screamed to retreat. Hager's axe caught him across the ribs, cutting through armor, parting flesh. Pain exploded through Kalen's side. He ignored it, driving his spear forward, the point punching through Hager's shoulder guard into muscle. Hager roared, not pain, but exultation. He ripped the spear from Kalen's hands, the shaft still embedded in his shoulder, and swung both axes in a devastating horizontal sweep. Kalen couldn't dodge. The axes caught him across the chest, breaking ribs, collapsing his lung. He went down hard, blood pouring from the wound. The referee was moving forward, about to call the match, and something happened. Kalen felt it like a surge of heat through his blood. The mark on his forehead burned. The pain in his chest transformed. becoming not a weakness but a fuel, feeding something deep inside him. He had been here before, on the ground, bleeding, defeated. In the melee trials, lying in the sand, watching the warrior raise his axe. But this time was different. This time, he chose to continue. He surged to his feet, drawing his short sword, and threw himself at Hagar. No technique, no strategy, just raw, desperate violence. The kind of mindless assault that should have gotten him killed instantly. But Hagar, surprised by the sudden resurgence, hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, Kaelin's sword found the gap in his armor, drove deep into his side, between the ribs, into vital organs. Hagar staggered, looked down at the sword buried in his torso, then looked up at Kaelin and incredibly smiled. "Good," he said. Blood poured from his mouth. "That's worthy." He collapsed. The arena fell silent. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then the crowd erupted. 50,000 voices screaming approval, screaming Khorne's name, screaming Kaelin's name. Kaelin stood over Hagar's body, his own blood soaking the sand, his broken ribs grinding with each breath. He had won. He had killed a champion. He raised his sword to the sky and roared. B-L-O-D. The crowd roared back. "Escuos, fate scaltage ron!" In that moment, Kaelin understood this was what he had been searching for. Not survival, not safety, but this, the moment of pure purpose, when everything aligned, when you became a perfect instrument of violence, when the blood god's favor was tangible, burning through your veins like liquid fire. He had found meaning, and it was glorious. Epilogue. THENDOF Kaelin spent 3 weeks in the medica facility recovering from the injuries Hagar had inflicted. Collapsed lung, broken ribs, deep lacerations, wounds that would have killed him in his worker days. But warriors received proper medical care. He was pieced back together with bio, glue, and regenerative stimulants, his body forced to heal at accelerated rates. During his recovery, he received visitors. Cross came to congratulate him on the victory. Other members of the Red Reapers stopped by to pay respects. Killing a champion elevated status significantly. Even Sergeant Kravos appeared once, saying only, "Adequate," before leaving. On the 19th day of recovery, he received an unexpected visitor. Mira, she had survived the melee trials, just as he had, and had apparently pursued the warrior's path as well. She wore the armor of the Red Reapers. They were in the same war, band, though different squads. Her face was more scarred than he remembered, but her eyes were the same sharp, calculating, alive. "Heard you killed Hagar," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Impressive." "Luck. Bullshit. I've watched Hagar fight." He didn't lose to luck. He lost to someone who refused to quit. Kaelin said nothing. Mira continued. "I told you I had a proposal, back before the trials. You remember?" "I remember. I'm forming a squad. Invitation only. Elite fighters who are tired of rotating through the standard arena schedule. We're going to volunteer for off-world deployment." Kaelin turned his head to look at her properly. Off-world deployment meant joining the Crimson Host's actual military campaigns, leaving Skarvash to fight on other worlds. It was the highest form of service a mortal warrior could aspire to, bringing Khorne's fury to the wider galaxy, spreading the blood god's worship through conquest. It was also essentially a death sentence. Off-world warriors rarely returned. They fought until they died on alien worlds light, years from home, their bones left to rot in strange soil. "Why tell me?" Kaelin asked. "Because you think. Most warriors are idiots. They charge in and get killed. You calculate. You survive. Off-world, that matters. Glory is great, but dead warriors can't earn more glory." "What makes you think I want to leave Skarvash?" Mira smiled. "Because I know what you've figured out, that this," she gestured, encompassing the medica facility, the hive beyond everything, "is a cage. Bigger than the worker dormitories, but still a cage. We fight in arenas for crowds. We kill each other for entertainment. We call it service, but it's performance. Real war happens out there." She pointed upward, toward the sky, toward the stars. "And if you're like me, you want the real thing." Kaelin was silent for a long time. She was right, of course. He had found meaning in the arena, but it was hollow meaning. Circular. He fought to prove himself worthy, and his worthiness earned him the right to fight more. And on, a loop that went nowhere. But off-world meant actual purpose. Actual war, not spectacle. It meant becoming part of something larger than arena schedules and quarterly quotas. It meant probable death within months. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Mira stood. "Take your time, but not too much time. We deploy in 3 months. I need your answer before then." She left. Kalen lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about choices and cages and the difference between existing and living. He thought about the man he had been, the factory worker, the skull processor, the hollow survivor who wanted nothing except to continue his empty routine. He thought about the man he had become, the warrior, the killer, the servant of the blood god who had found terrible purpose in violence and glory. And he thought about the man he might still become, if he lived long enough, if he survived the wars beyond Skarvash, if Khorne's favor held. 3 days later, he was cleared for light duty. He returned to the Red Reaper's barracks and resumed training. His body was healing, but not yet at full strength. He sparred carefully, rebuilding his conditioning, relearning his limits. On the 5th day back, he found Mira in the training yard. "I'm in," he said. She nodded, unsurprised. "Good. Report to Staging Area 12 tomorrow at dawn. Bring only what you can carry. Everything else gets issued when we reach the transport." "Where are we going?" "Officially, a world called Vangriff's Reach, in the Crypta system, Orc Infestation. The Crimson Host is deploying 3 companies to cleanse it." Unofficially, she smiled, cold and sharp. "Does it matter? One war is the same as another. We'll fight, we'll kill, we'll serve. That's all we need to know." Staging Area 12. The staging area was a massive complex near the Hive starport, where off-world deployments were processed. Hundreds of warriors from various war bands gathered there. Red Reapers, Brass Hounds, the Bloodtide Legion, and a dozen others. They milled in organized chaos, checking equipment, receiving final briefings, saying farewells to those who would remain behind. Kalen had no one to say farewell to. His parents were long dead or lost. He didn't know which and no longer cared. His worker life had contained no friends, no connections worth maintaining. He had shed that existence like a snake shedding skin. His squadmates from Crimson, 7 were here: Senna, Jorik, Ness, Lyra. They had all volunteered for off-world deployment, drawn by the same hunger for real purpose. They gathered as a unit, checking each other's gear with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had bled together. "Heard the orcs on Vangriff's Reach are big," Jorik said, his tone oddly enthusiastic. 3 meters tall, tough as hell. Takes multiple hits to put them down." "Good," Senna replied. "I'm tired of fighting humans. They die too easily." Lyra was cleaning her weapons with meticulous care, her expression distant. She was the youngest of them, barely 20, but already frighteningly competent. "Remember," she said, not looking up from her work, "we stay together. Standard deployment protocol assigns squads to different platoons, but I've filed transfer requests. We deploy as a unit or we don't deploy." "They approved that?" Kalen asked. "I have connections." Her father was an enforcer, Kalen remembered. Connections that apparently extended beyond Skarvash's surface. A horn blew, the assembly call. The warriors formed into loose columns and began marching toward the starport proper. Kalen fell into step with his squad, his armor feeling heavy but reassuring, his weapons a familiar weight. The starport was a vast cavern carved into the Hive's upper levels, open to the smog-choked sky. Ships rested in cradles of metal and stone, transports mostly ugly and functional, designed to move troops and cargo, not to inspire awe. Their destination sat in the largest cradle, a massive vessel, easily 300 meters long, its hull painted crimson and decorated with Khornate iconography. The Eternal Rage, a transport ship operated by the Crimson Host. They boarded via massive ramps, hundreds of warriors streaming into the ship's belly. The interior was cramped, utilitarian, rows of crash harnesses bolted to the walls, storage lockers, bare metal everywhere. No windows, no comfort. Just functional space designed to deliver killers to their destinations. Kalen found his assigned harness and secured himself. Around him, others did the same. The process took over an hour, nearly 1,000 warriors being loaded, along with equipment, ammunition, supplies. Finally, the ramps retracted. The ship's engines ignited with a roar that shook the entire structure. Through the hull, Kylan could feel the vibrations building, could sense the immense power being channeled through the ship's systems. Then they were lifting, rising through the starport's opening, climbing toward the poisoned sky. Kylan had never left Skarvash. Few workers ever did. Off-world travel was reserved for the elite, for warriors and priests, and those whose service demanded it. He pressed his face to a small observation port near his harness, watching as the hive fell away below him. From this height, Skarvash looked like what it was, a massive wound in the planet's surface, a sprawling infection of metal and stone and blood, rust surrounded by ash wastes that stretched to every horizon. The main hive was the largest structure, but smaller settlements dotted the landscape. Mining colonies, agri-complexes, manufactorums, each one a smaller version of the same hell. This was home. This was the world that had consumed his adult life, that had taken a factory worker and ground him down and rebuilt him as a killer. He felt nothing looking at it. No nostalgia, no hatred. Just acknowledgement this was where he had been forged, and now he was leaving. The ship climbed higher, piercing the cloud layer. For a brief moment, Kalen saw actual sunlight, clean, unfiltered. The first he had seen in 11 years. It was almost painful, too bright, too pure. Then they were through the atmosphere, into the void, and Skarvash became just another planet, just another speck in an endless galaxy of violence. The warp, the voyage to Vangriff's Reach, would take approximately 6 weeks, accounting for warp travel and necessary real space navigation. The warriors settled into the grim routine of transport, life, weapons, maintenance, physical training in the ship's limited spaces, combat drills, endless games of chance using dice carved from bone. Kalen spent his time studying. Mira had provided him with tactical briefings on orcs, their psychology, their combat patterns, their weaknesses. He memorized everything: how they moved, how they thought, how they died. Knowledge was survival. Knowledge was advantage. The ship entered the warp on the 3rd day. The transition was violent. Reality tearing, the ship plunging into the Imperium, that roiling hell, dimension where physics was merely a suggestion and daemons lurked in the spaces between thoughts. The Jeller field held. It was a bubble of reality, protecting the ship from the warp's touch. But it wasn't perfect. Kalen could feel the wrongness pressing against his consciousness, like fingers probing at the edges of his sanity. The air tasted of copper and ozone. Sometimes, if he wasn't careful, he could see things in his peripheral vision, shapes that shouldn't exist, movements that defied geometry. The ship's priests conducted daily rituals, leading the warriors in prayer to Khorne, using devotion as armor against the warp's corrupting influence. Kalen participated, finding the familiar catechisms strangely comforting. The words were simple, violent, grounding. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. We are his weapons. We exist to kill. Glory through combat. Honor through strength. Simple truths in a universe of chaos. 3 weeks into the voyage, something went wrong. The breach. Kalen woke to alarms screaming, red emergency lighting flashing through the transport hold. Around him, warriors scrambled from their harnesses, reaching for weapons, responding to training even before full consciousness returned. BREH! The Vox speakers crackled with panic. AL Waro Arstio Defersi Paustitiams! Jalafi IMTRINTE SC. Section 7 was 4 levels down toward the ship's engineering section. The Jeller field had failed. Not completely, or they would all be dead already, consumed by daemons in seconds. But compromised meant a weak point, a crack through which warp entities could slip. The warriors formed into squads automatically. Crimson, 7 gathered around Kalen, weapons ready. Eyes sharp. We hold here? Lyra said. Her voice was steady, Commander, cold. If they breach into this section, we hold the corridor, funnels them, limits their numbers' advantage. What are we fighting? Nez asked, checking his lasgun's charge. Does it matter? Senna's knives were already in her hands, gleaming in the emergency lighting. Daemons die like anything else. Just takes more effort. The distant sound of weapons fire reached them. Bolters, lasguns, screaming. The fight had begun in the lower levels. Kalen listened, trying to gauge the battle's progression. The shooting was intense but not panicked. Controlled fire. The ship's defenders were holding. Then the temperature dropped. It happened instantly. Comfortable air becoming Arctic cold, breath misting, frost forming on metal surfaces. Kalen's armor had temperature regulation, but even through it, he felt the chill. They're coming, Lyra said unnecessarily. The first daemon manifested at the corridor's far end. It was a bloodletter, one of Khorne's lesser daemons, the same kind Kalen had seen in the skull processing facility years ago. 3 meters of muscle and rage, wielding a hellblade, its skin the color of fresh blood, its eyes pits of infinite malice. But this one was wrong, distorted. The warp's touch had warped it during manifestation, and instead of the relatively stable form bloodletters normally possessed, this one was partially incorporeal, flickering between solid and not solid, reality and unreality. Fire! Lyra's command cut through the moment of frozen shock. Ness's lasgun barked, the beam striking the daemon's chest. The bloodletter staggered but didn't fall. Weapons were adequate against daemons but not ideal. They lacked the metaphysical weight of blessed weapons, the kind that could harm warp entities effectively. The daemon charged. Kalen moved to intercept, his spear leveled. The hellblade descended. He parried, his spear's shaft barely deflecting the blow. The force of the impact jarred his entire body. The daemon was strong, far stronger than any human opponent. Senna darted in from the side, her knives seeking the daemon's exposed flank. Both blades struck home, punching through the daemon's hide. But the wounds wept fire instead of blood, and the daemon didn't seem to notice. It backhanded her, sending her flying into the wall. Jorik bellowed and swung his maul in a devastating overhead arc. The weapon caught the bloodletter in the shoulder, caving in bone and muscle. The daemon roared and swung its hellblade at Jorik's head. Kalen's spear took it through the throat. The daemon convulsed. For a moment, its form destabilized completely, becoming translucent, barely visible. Then it collapsed, the body dissolving into ichor and smoke. On taboo, Lyra shouted. Roifarm! T-A-R-L-B-E more! She was right. 2 more bloodletters manifested at the corridor's end, flickering into existence from nothing. Behind them, something larger stirred in the shadows, a presence that made the air itself feel heavy, oppressive. The battle devolved into grinding attrition. The squad fought in rotation, front fighters engaging, rear fighters providing support, wounded rotating back to recover. Kalen lost track of time. There was only the cycles strike, parry, thrust, retreat, recover, engage again. They killed 6 bloodletters before the larger presence finally manifested. The bloodthirster, it was a bloodthirster. A greater daemon of Khorne, one of the blood god's mightiest servants. 4 meters tall, winged, armored in brass plates that seemed to grow from its flesh, wielding a massive axe that radiated hatred like heat. The sight of it froze Kalen's blood. This was not something mortals fought. This was not something mortals survived. Bloodthirsters were living avatars of slaughter, capable of killing scores of warriors in seconds, of leveling fortifications with their bare hands. The daemon looked at them, 5 mortals in battered armor, holding a corridor with desperation and stubborn will, and laughed. The sound was not human, not even remotely human. It was the sound of mountains collapsing, of civilizations burning, of hope dying. Then it charged. What followed was not combat, it was survival. The bloodthirster's axe carved through space, each swing capable of bisecting a warrior. They scattered, tried to flank. attempted to use their numbers to overwhelm. Useless. The daemon was too fast, too strong, too everything. Nez died in the first seconds, cut in half at the waist. Jorik managed to land a hit with his maul before the daemon's axe removed his head. Kalen thrust his spear at the daemon's side. The point scraped across brass armor, failing to penetrate. The daemon backhanded him casually, the impact breaking ribs, sending him sprawling. He lay on the deck, gasping, watching as Senna tried desperately to get inside the daemon's guard. She was fast, skilled, but not fast enough. The bloodthirster caught her with its free hand, lifted her by the throat, and squeezed. Her neck snapped with a sound like breaking wood. Only Lyra remained. She stood between the daemon and Kalen, her weapon, a chainsword, held in both hands, her face set in grim determination. "Blood for the blood god," she whispered. The daemon's response was instant. "BLO de four, THBLO de faco." It brought its axe down in a strike meant to split her in half, and then it stopped. The bloodthirster froze mid-swing, its axe hovering centimeters from Lyra's head. Its expression, if such a term could apply to a daemon's face, shifted from rage to confusion to something like frustration. Then it was gone, not banished, not killed, just gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The Jeller field had been restored. The breach was sealed. The warp entities were cut off from real space again, forced back into the Imperium. Silence fell, broken only by Kalen's ragged breathing and the distant sound of damage control alarms. Lyra dropped to her knees, her chainsword clattering to the deck. She was shaking, shock and adrenaline finally catching up with her. Kalen forced himself to sit up, pain screaming from his broken ribs. Around him, the corridor was a charnel house. Bodies, or pieces of bodies, littered the deck. 3 of his squad were dead. Only he and Lyra remained. They had survived. Barely, but they had survived. Vangriff's Reach, the Eternal Rage, limped into the Cryptus system 2 weeks later than scheduled. The warp breach had damaged critical systems, forced lengthy repairs. Of the 1,000 warriors who had boarded at Skarvash, 743 remained. The rest had died fighting daemons or been lost when sections of the ship were vented to space to contain breaches. Kaelin and Lyra were folded into a new squad, survivors from other units who had also lost their teammates. Familiar faces gone, replaced by strangers. But they were all warriors, all servants of Khorne. That was connection enough. Vangriff's Reach appeared in the viewports as they descended. A gray world, its surface scarred by impact craters and the sprawling fungal growths that indicated orc infestation. The planet had been human once, a mining colony. Now it was an orc stronghold, conquered and held by a warboss called Urgrok the Immortal. The Crimson Host's objective was simple: kill Urgrok, break the orc command structure, and claim the world for Khorne. Simple, not easy, but simple. The drop was violent. Transport shuttles plummeting through atmosphere, anti-air fire reaching up from the surface, explosions bracketing the formation. 2 shuttles were destroyed before reaching the ground. The rest crashed down in a designated landing zone, ramps dropping. Warriors pouring out into hostile territory. Kalen's first impression of Vangriff's Reach: mud. Endless mud, the consistency of clay, clutching at boots, making every step an effort. The sky was gray, perpetually overcast. The air tasted of fungus and gun smoke. Orc weapons opened fire immediately, crude but effective, massive caliber rounds tearing through the landing zone. Warriors scattered, seeking cover, returning fire. This was war, not performance, not arena combat. Real war. Chaos and confusion and death delivered randomly by enemies you couldn't see. Kalen threw himself behind a crashed shuttle's hull, last bolts zipping over his head. Around him, other warriors did the same, forming a defensive perimeter. Someone was screaming orders, an officer organizing the chaos into something resembling tactics. An orc burst from the mud 20 meters away, massive, green, skinned, wielding a weapon that looked like a combination of chainsaw and gun. It charged. Roaring in its brutal language, Kalen shot it 3 times. The orc staggered but kept coming. He shot it twice more. It fell 5 meters away, twitching, still trying to reach him even as it died. Tough. Jorik was right. They're incredibly tough. The battle raged for 3 hours. By the end, the landing zone was secured, the immediate orc forces driven back or slaughtered. But the cost had been high, nearly 100 warriors dead in the first engagement alone. This was going to be a long campaign. Kelensiel Yusiun. Theetrnl War, 6 months on Vangriff's Reach taught Kalen more about war than 11 years on Skarvash. He learned how to fight in mud in ruins, in fungal forests where orcs could be hiding behind any growth. He learned to sleep in armor, to eat while moving, to identify targets by sound when visibility was measured in meters. He learned what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, not a squad or a war band, but an actual military force, thousands strong, operating with coordinated purpose. He learned that Khorne's service was infinite. There would always be another world, another enemy, another war. The campaign on Vangriff's Reach would end. Eventually, they would kill Urgrok or die trying. But then there would be the next world, the next target, the next opportunity to spill blood in the blood god's name. It was a treadmill, endless and brutal, grinding warriors down until they fell and were replaced by fresh bodies from worlds like Skarvash. But it was also glorious. Every day brought new challenges. Every battle was a test. Every victory was meaningful, contributing to something greater than arena spectacle or quota fulfillment. This was what he had been seeking. This was purpose. On the 201st day of the campaign, Kalen's squad was assigned to a forward assault on an orc stronghold. The objective: breach the walls, kill the defenders, secure the structure for use as a staging point for future operations. The assault went badly from the start. Orc resistance was fiercer than anticipated. The walls were stronger, the defenders more numerous. Kalen's squad was pinned down under heavy fire, taking casualties, the assault stalling. He found himself in a crater, pressed flat against mud, bullets hammering the air above him. Around him, warriors were dying, shot, crushed, blown apart by orc explosives. The assault was failing. He could stay in the crater, could wait for extraction or reinforcement, could survive, or he could charge. The choice was instantaneous. He surged from the crater, roaring Khorne's name, his weapon raised, and sprinted toward the orc positions. Around him, other warriors saw his charge and joined. 5, then 10, then 20, the momentum building, transforming failed assault into desperate attack. They hit the orc lines like a bloody tide. Kalen's spear punched through green flesh, his armor turned aside crude blades, his voice added to the chorus of screaming warriors. They fought with the madness of those who had abandoned survival and embraced only victory or death. The orcs broke. The walls fell. The stronghold was taken. In the aftermath, standing among the bodies of the dead, orc and human alike, Kalen realized something profound. He was happy. Not in the simple sense. Not comfort or pleasure or satisfaction, but happy in the way a weapon is happy when it cuts, in the way a fire is happy when it burns. He was fulfilling his purpose. He was exactly what he was meant to be. A warrior of Khorne, a killer in service to the blood god, a small piece of a vast, eternal machine dedicated to one simple truth. That violence was the purest form of existence, that strength was the highest virtue, that the only meaning worth having was found at the edge of a blade. This was daily life under Khorne. This was what it meant to live in the blood god's domain. Not the grinding horror of Skarvash's worker dormitories, though that was part of it. Not the performative violence of the arenas, though that too had its place. But this, the eternal campaign, world after world, war after war, each one a prayer, each kill an offering, each day another opportunity to prove your worth. It was monstrous. It was brutal. It was hell made manifest. And for those who had been shaped by it, for those who had surrendered themselves to its terrible logic, it was also the only life worth living. Kalen raised his spear to the gray sky and roared, blowed, around him, 50 voices answered, SKLS for TH SQLA Traumi. The war continued. The war would always continue, and that was exactly as it should be. Author's note. This story depicts life under one of the Chaos Gods as it would realistically exist, not as external threat or temporary corruption, but as complete civilization. Skarvash represents what happens when Khorne's worship becomes infrastructure, when violence becomes economics, when blood sport becomes both entertainment and theology. The horror is not in individual acts of violence. The Imperium itself is plenty violent, but in the total reorganization of society around such acts, in the way humans adapt even to hell and find meaning even in monstrosity. Kalen's journey from worker to warrior is not redemption. It's damnation, rendered in slow degrees, so gradual that the victim doesn't realize what he's lost until it's far too late. He finds purpose, meaning, even happiness, but only by surrendering everything that made him human in any recognizable sense. This is what chaos does. Not instant corruption, not obvious evil, but the slow transformation of desperate need into willing service, of survival into devotion, of humanity into something that serves the dark powers with the same mindless efficiency that the Imperium citizens serve the Emperor. There are no heroes here. There are no victories. There is only the grinding continuation of existence in service to forces that care nothing for individual suffering or triumph. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne forever.